Hello, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to How the Light Gets In's Winter Revel. My name's Rana Mitter. I teach the history and politics of modern China at Oxford University here in the UK, where I'm sitting at the moment in lockdown. And today I want to talk to you about a concept which, in a sense, has become a bit of a cliche, but a cliche which I think can be unraveled with actually quite a lot of useful purpose in understanding one of the countries in the world which is making the most waves, but sometimes provokes the least level of understanding. And that is, of course, China. China, the country that is in the minds of pretty much every person in every Western capital these days, Washington, DC, London, Berlin, wherever it might be, and whose behavior and whose actions sometimes seem to be, in some ways, very hard to understand. So getting to the heart of what really makes up China's DNA is my task in the next half hour or so. I'm going to take you through some ideas about that. Let's start, though, with this gentleman here. Probably familiar to you from the news, I hope so anyway. Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, President of the People's Republic of China, and a whole variety of other very grand positions in addition to that. Now, Xi Jinping has regularly been in the news when he turns up at some of the premier spots where the West talks to itself. And Davos, the World Economic Forum, inevitably is going to be one of those places. And I've got two pictures here. The lower one is of Xi Jinping speaking in 2017 at Davos. And the one at the top is actually him speaking at virtual Davos, because, of course, it was online this year because of the pandemic. Both of these talks by Xi Jinping had some similarities, and both of them had some differences. Essentially, the one in 2017 is worth remembering because it was given in the month that Donald J. Trump was inaugurated as President of the United States. And the second one was given in the month that Donald J. Trump left the presidency of the United States to make way for Joe Biden. And in both of these talks, the message from Xi Jinping about China in the world was quite similar. He talked about China as being the country that really was underpinning international order, the country which really people had to pay attention to if they wanted to support free and fair trade, the upholding of broader human values, a whole variety of very warm-sounding, very positive-sounding elements, which I think in both cases were being formulated by him without him ever saying so, to try and provide a point of contrast with the United States. And that contrast perhaps was stronger in the era of Donald Trump, a president who decided that he was going to diverge from the international order that had become so much part of the world we've lived in since 1945, and perhaps not, seems less divergent in the era of a perhaps more conventional president. But to understand what it was that Xi Jinping was trying to say, I think, during those talks, we have to understand a bit more about where he and the Chinese Communist Party and wider Chinese society have been coming from for years and decades, and in some cases, even centuries. Now, the expression that something is in someone's DNA, freedom is in America's DNA, order is in China's DNA, whatever, is, as I said, a bit of a cliche. I mean, DNA, is not the right way to think about big, large, complex societies in a very detailed, sort of granular way. But I think this idea of something that's fundamental to them can be useful. And in this particular case, the reason that I think that this DNA model is a useful way to think about it is because of what those elements are. And I'm going to argue during the course of the next 20 minutes or so that if we understand four particular factors: authoritarianism, consumerism, globalization, and technology, these four, then those four factors and the way they recombine with each other tells us something quite fundamental about why modern China, why contemporary China is the way it is and the way it's going to be for quite some time to come, and why it's so different from so many other societies around the world. And those of you who are biologists, or even if you're not biologists, may have spotted there's another reason why the DNA metaphor, analogy appealed to me so much. Those initials, A, C, G, T, that you see on screen right now, they are, of course, also the initials of the names of the nucleotides, the four different chemicals that make up a strand of DNA. So although the order ACGT is slightly different in DNA, the initials are the same. And that's another reason that I thought this was quite a useful mnemonic in terms of understanding what the elements are. Because like DNA, if you take those ACGT nucleotides and put them together, DNA makes up so much more than the sum of its parts. It's a very long distance from looking under an electron microscope at a little speck of DNA and seeing a human being, even though, of course, one is made up of the other. And in the case of China, these four factors are a starting point, but they're not enough. The combination, the recombination, and the making of more than the sum of the parts is why China is, I think, so distinctive. Well, to understand that, I think we need to think a bit more about the sources of Chinese conduct. I use the word conduct there to echo the essay back in 1947, I think it was, by George Kennan, the great American geopolitical thinker, about what he called the sources of Soviet conduct. Since in those days it was the Soviet Union, not China, that was the major geopolitical opposite to the Western world. And thinking about China today, I think that the Chinese Communist Party, the party state that runs China, draws its legitimacy from a whole variety of sources. The one it doesn't draw from, of course, is democratic legitimacy, because China neither has a liberal democratic system based on elections, nor does it make any pretense, certainly these days, of wanting to do so. So where does it draw its sense of strength and legitimacy from? Well, I'd say there are several factors. Number one is its modern history, the story that China tells about itself to its own people, and that it tells in the wider world, is a story of repeated invasion and defense against outside occupation and attack. That starts in the mid-19th century with the Opium Wars, where the British, of course, turn up with gunboats off the south coast of China, wanting to break open the doors of China's closed economy as they saw it, selling opium, and also bringing along with them Bibles, missionaries, Western modes of thinking, and modernity in general. And for many Chinese, certainly at the time and even now, the century that followed was a very unhappy one, from the 1830s through to the 1940s. Then, and even now, sometimes called the century of humiliation for China, as I say, a very unhappy period. And this includes factors or events such as the occupation of Hong Kong at the end of the Opium War, the ceding of parts of Manchuria and northeast China in the 1890s and 1900s, and eventually, of course, the occupation of Manchuria by the Japanese in the 1930s, ultimately leading to the outbreak of full-scale World War II in Asia. 1937 is when that starts in China, and the war goes on for 8 years till 1945, when China finally ends up on the Allied side in the war, exhausted, but ultimately victorious. So that whole history of attack, oppression, and defense against the outside is one factor that explains the highly defensive language that you hear so often when China chooses to define itself to the outside world. My own take is that much of this, I think, is deeply exaggerated these days. China today is a strong country, whereas 100 years ago, it was very much a weak country. But that having been said, you can understand historically one of the reasons why that sense of oppression from outside remains a very powerful factor. The second factor is the one that you tend to come up with most when you deal with China's place in the world as an economic or business actor, which is the idea that whatever you think of it, China's economic reforms, certainly since the late 1970s, early 1980s, have provided the source for a huge increase in poverty reduction or enrichment, if you want to put it in a more positive way, in China itself over the last 40 years. Regardless of the methods, and the methods can often be quite brutal and quite painful, you can look at the statistics and see that from being an immensely impoverished country in the 1970s, China has moved to being, as I'm sure you're aware, the second biggest economy in the world in the 2010s, 2020s. That shift did not come from nowhere. So that ability of the Chinese system, authoritarian and dictatorial though it is, to provide economic growth and wealth, is a very important pillar of legitimacy. The third one, and again, it's one that's sometimes underappreciated, I think, is the dependence on what you might call traditional thought, particularly thinking of great Chinese philosophers of the past like Confucius, who had a whole variety of ideas that we still find very congenial today, the idea of a harmonious world being one of them, and other ideas that, frankly, are probably not so congenial if you look into them in any detail. Confucians and traditional Confucian thinking was not about equality, but about hierarchy. And in the modern world, we don't tend to think very much about hierarchy as something that societies might actually want rather than trying to overcome. But in the case of traditional Confucian thinking.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.